life in the diocese? Tell me the story.
Well, our diocese had been part of the International Indaba project that took place a couple of years ago. We were partnered with Derbyshire in England and Mumbai in India. And so we went through a year where on 3 occasions a group of clergy and lay people from our diocese went off to England and India, and then folks from there came here. And I kind of watched that happen and lived through that experience vicariously. When I became bishop, I knew that we were at a place in our life in the diocese where we needed to address some of the deep fundamental questions around money and mission, resources and structure. In other words, we needed to begin engaging a strategic plan. But we are an extraordinarily diverse diocese, a very large diocese with 200 churches, speak 14 languages, and we encompass, or we include in the Diocese of New York, some of the wealthiest people in America and some of the poorest. I suppose if you had a good enough arm, you could throw a baseball from the Upper East Side in Manhattan to the South Bronx, and you would be going from one world to another when you did so. But it's not just urban. Our diocese extends all the way up into the Catskill Mountains. We have urban poverty and rural poverty. We have urban wealth and rural wealth. We have small towns, industrial centers, large suburbs and exurbs, as well as within the city of New York, encompassing Manhattan, the Bronx, and Staten Island. So as I began to think about how we would begin to have the perhaps difficult conversations around the use of resources and the structure of our diocese, how we do mission, church planting, these kind of questions, I began to worry that without what I began calling in my mind a shared understanding of our common life, we had all the chance in the world to fail at our endeavor, unless we begin first to find a way for us to talk to one another across regions and cultures in the Diocese of New York. To have people begin to go into church doors and to meet people they would otherwise not have met, and to get a broader vision of the church in our diocese than they might get just by looking at their local context. I sat in early 2012, relatively new, well, very new at that point, elected bishop, at a staff meeting. And Johanna Schaefer, who had been part of our International Indaba team, they had just finished, and she was doing a presentation about their experience. And as I sat there listening to her, it occurred to me that Manhattan, or New York, is not more different than Mumbai, than Manhattan is from Sullivan County in our diocese, Appalachian, Catskill County, or that Sullivan County is from the Bronx, or the Bronx from the wealthier parts of Westchester County, or Westchester County from Staten Island. And as I began to listen to her, I thought that perhaps an internal Indaba in our diocese might not be the way for us to begin to pull these disparate parts of our common life together and help to give everyone a vision of who we are together as a diocese. That's where it came from. We had just under a third of our churches participate. We had some folks, when they heard that number, ask me, why didn't everyone participate? But everyone doesn't ever participate in everything. To have a third of our diocese come out and participate in a project called Indaba, which most people didn't know what that meant, something new that we'd never done before, with a relatively high commitment required of the participants, was such that when I discovered that we had a third of our churches in it, I was extraordinarily glad about that, very satisfied. Now, we had early in the fall, I think in September, we had our kickoff event here at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. So with 60-some participating churches and teams of 4 from each one, and the facilitators and everyone else involved in this, I looked out in the cathedral at really a small sea of people, and I was extraordinarily inspired by the self-offering that all of these people were making to come and be part of this, but also by the wonderful good spirit in the room and the sense of excitement as people met their Indaba partners for the first time, began to introduce themselves, and get a sense of what this experience might be like. This was followed then by, at scattered intervals, the 3 Indaba weekends, where our teams met up with each other, one of those in each of the 3 locations, as Indaba does. And after the first weekend, which was in October, I began running into people immediately, within days, who had come back from their Indaba weekend. And I was hearing things that, quite frankly, I couldn't understand, had no context for. People telling me, Bishop Dietsche, this is the most important thing I've ever done in my life in the church. Bishop, this has changed my life. I'll never be the same again. And there was a part of me that wondered with a little anxiety, oh my God, what have I done? And yet what was happening was astonishing. It was wonderful. And it took a little while for me to begin to understand something of the mystery that occurred within these Indaba weekends. And one of our deacons helped me to understand, George Dias. And we were talking one day, and George talked a little bit about their first Indaba experience. And he said, you know, Bishop, the requirement that we stay in one another's homes, which quite frankly had been a deal breaker for some people. But those who participated anteed up, they bought in, and they did it. He said the requirement that we stay in one another's homes was the key to the personal transformations that happen in these relationships. He said when we met with our Indaba partners, Saturday was great. But then that night, we split up and we went to private homes. We spent the night in people's houses. We got up in the morning and had breakfast with them at their kitchen tables, and then we went off to church together. He said, when I saw the members of my own parish together at church, I could see we were all different. We had all changed. Now, I know that there are cultures in the world where inviting strangers into one's home and providing that kind of hospitality is part of the culture. It is not in America. And so we had asked people to accept and embrace a level of vulnerability, risk to their sense of privacy or self that was unusual and uncommon. They had done it, and what happened was that human connections were made that were utterly transformative for everyone.
You talked in your address to Diocesan Convention of someone who, following the first Indaba weekend, challenged you about the consequence of these new relationships. What have you done? Have you created a monster?
If I've created a monster, I think it's a friendly monster. It's Puff the Magic Dragon. It's not a Godzilla. What has happened, as you note, a woman from one of our Manhattan parishes who had come back from an Indaba weekend that included one of our poorer churches in the Bronx and another outlying parish, had told me about her remarkable experience at Indaba, gone away and then come back and said, and you know, Bishop, this has consequences for you. And I laughed and I said, tell me what those are. She said, if you go to close one of those small churches, you need to know there are friends now. And I said, that was the whole point from the beginning. I haven't created a monster. What I've created is, I'm sorry, I haven't created it. This has been a work of the Holy Spirit. If all I did in this process was to create a place for people to come together and then ask the Spirit to act in and among them. And this is what's happened. It's not a monster, but what we've created is a community of people representing about a third of our diocese who are now deeply invested in the lives and ministries and contexts, culturally and geographically, economically, racially, and ethnically. People who are very different than they are live lives very different than they do in places that are strange to them. And what that means now, and as I was told by this woman, if we need to make hard decisions about some of our ministries in the diocese, she said, we're invested in it, we're going to be there, we're going to hold your feet to the fire, we're going to be in that conversation with you, which is all I ever wanted. Another way of saying that is, we're developing the shared understanding of our common life.
One of the topics that comes up often in thinking about Indaba is what effect that shared understanding of a common life has on our power structures. What are your thoughts on power and Indaba?
Well, I don't know entirely how to answer that yet. Let me say that we're still living into this experience. You were with us on Saturday, which was only 3 or 4 days ago, for the Wrapping Up event, which was a wonderful celebration. We have begun to introduce the next steps of where we'll go with Indaba in the diocese, but we haven't really lived into this yet. And how this plays out in terms of a change of culture in the diocese, I don't know yet. I have said, and the convention has heard me, that we are going to change the culture of the Diocese of New York. I have observed that it takes 11 miles to turn around an ocean liner, and that the work of cultural change will occupy my whole episcopate and that of my successor, most likely. So when we look at issues of power and hierarchy, I know that these are realities in the life of the Church. I hope that as we come through Indaba, that my participation in this with the people of my diocese will be a way for us to redefine to some degree, or at least reimagine and experience in a new way what power, yes, but let's say authority and shared authority can mean among us. So that one of the things that's clearly come out of this first Indaba experience is that people in the diocese who in fact have felt powerless have found some empowerment and some shared life with people that they would have viewed as having occupied the seats of power across the diocese. So I'm not going to say that it's a leveling, but what I will say is that there are conversations happening across the power structure that are changing the way, already changing the way, that we would talk about that and think about that, and then potentially change the way that we experience and live with power going forward.